by psychology. The only way that we can do that is by getting people who are in all these different disciplines working together to tackle those problems and bring together their expertise holistically. So that's basically the background to it. And it's quite big. We're going to have 86 students come through within 5 cohorts. We're currently recruiting cohort 4. So there's already about 40 of us, I think maybe 42 of us. And the idea is that by the end, it will be a very, very big community of active researchers dealing with all sorts of aspects of this problem. If you can give me the next slide, please, Rita.
Is it? Okay, sorry.
Yeah. So essentially, to dig into this a little bit more, the sorts of issues we might be dealing with are, for example, with EVs. It sounds very, very simple. Okay, if you have an electric car, there won't be any tailpipe emissions. But the reality, obviously, is much more complex than that. And to try and get EVs operating as they theoretically can be in terms of efficiency and in terms of their sort of potential environmental benefit relies on understanding driver behavior and making sure that people can actually drive them in a way that is efficient, being able to develop supply chains that actually don't embed a lot of carbon emissions in the development of an electric vehicle or in the development of the battery, and to be able to develop recycling, for example, to ensure that at the end of that battery's lifespan, it doesn't then become a huge problem that we've got a lot of partially or fully depleted batteries that we're not able to effectively use. And we've created another downstream problem that we haven't properly realized. So that's one example of many of the areas where this sort of approach is being used to try and say, how can we think about these problems holistically now to make sure that the solutions that we're coming up with are practical, sustainable, and achievable? And if I can have the next slide, please, Rita. So zooming out a bit from the CDT, again, as Nick said, the CDT's nested in IAAPS, which is the Institute for Advanced Automotive Propulsion Systems. And this is a very, very big new institute within the University of Bath. And the picture that you can see on the slide is a £70 million research facility that's literally just been built and is about to go live. And that has chassis dynos in it. It's got very, very, very advanced analytic systems and testing systems, and we'll be working with automotive companies from all around the country and actually globally to test vehicles, to develop systems in that facility. And there are also academics from all departments in the University of Bath who are heavily involved within IAAPS because it's a transdisciplinary institute. So it captures people from social sciences, obviously automotive engineering, chemical engineering, all areas, to take that same approach of saying, how can we get everybody together to solve these problems effectively, holistically, and practically, so that we get solutions which actually work and are scalable. So this broadly is the context in which we're working, and it's through IAAPS and the CDT that we came into contact with Nick and Alex and the IAM as a whole, and we've sort of been working with them to say, well, how do our expertise as individuals and as an institute fit with your needs? And if we can have the next slide, please, Rita. And so we just wanted to give a little bit of background just on us so that you know who's talking at you, really. And so my name's Catherine. As you can see, my email's on the slide, and you're more than welcome to email me if you wish. I'm from a psychology background, and principally I started in very much human factors, situation awareness. It was actually to do with firefighting rather than automotive, but obviously the theoretical principles are very much transferable. And in terms of my work within transport, it's looking at situation awareness and also human-machine interactions and road user interactions more generally, and including in that sort of the introduction of autonomy, as well as road user to road user kind of direct human to human interactions. I do a lot of work with road user vulnerability and how you can ensure that mixed road user interactions are safe. And as an extension of that, I look at mode choice and modal shift and how all these sorts of factors influence that. And now I'll hand over talking duties to Rita. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm Rita and I'm also a part of the IAAPS CDT, although I entered a year after Catherine did. I have a master's degree in civil engineering in the area of transportation engineering and urban planning. And my interests lie mostly in sort of planning for this future mobility network and ensuring that it's safe, reliable, and accessible. And this not only entails the transportation system overall, but also the infrastructure, having to do also with policy and the stakeholders that are a part of it. And we are also really glad to be able to count on the support and endorsement of IAM RoadSmart through their Director of Policy and Research, Neil Grigg, and the Head of PR and Communications, Heather Butcher, whose interest lies also in developing additional opportunities to further driver education. And so at the beginning of our collaboration, we had several meetings with Alex and Nick, and a few where Heather was also present as well. And we intended on exploring what were the themes we could contribute towards. And we sort of found these 4 potential areas of mutual interest. So the first one has to do with driver education, which could be considered as this set of lessons and techniques dedicated to help drivers in areas such as, well, driving the vehicle, obviously, and then basic maintenance and safety precautions as well. The second one is related to policy, which could be dedicated to traffic regulations and laws, as well as also encompassing the assurance that there is safety during the entire driving activity. With the infrastructure planning, we are sort of aiming to explore ways of planning road infrastructure in a way that ensures safety when driving, and also make it easier for the driver to be aware of the surroundings and take the necessary precautions whenever, in case it's needed. And last but not least, it is intended to obviously explore the automotive propulsion systems. And this could be either through the current transitions we are undergoing, so the transition towards electric vehicles or hydrogen vehicles, or through the educating actually the drivers towards eco-driving. So this could be in order to optimize fuel, or even better to reduce CO2 emissions. And as previously mentioned, IAAPS and APS intend on being involved at a local and a national level through student engagement, providing vehicle demonstrations. We have currently a Prius plug-in hybrid vehicle and a BMW i8. We hope to exchange knowledge about the aforementioned themes, and we will try as much as possible to help publicizing future events and partnerships. And to make sure that we achieve all of these, we have expressed our commitment through a support letter that we have sent Nick, I think, this month, with a detailed list of activities and areas that we would like to collaborate on and with IAM. And I think this is all from us. And if you have any questions, we would be more than happy to answer them.
So the letter there is the one I've written to Matt Barber, who's the Thames Valley Police and Crime Commissioner, thanking him for the £1,000 he gave us towards the funding of this recently. We're going to go to a ceremony and pick up what's been awarded to us on the 13th of December. So I sent that letter out to say this is what we're going to use the funds for. Please, can we have another go? 6 months' time when it's time to do it again. Can you hear us talking, you two, down there?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we can have an interactive session on questions. Thank you very much, first of all, for that. You've got about 20 or 22 members here, plus Alex and myself. There is a hand up already, so I will ask what that question is, and maybe if you can't hear it, I'll feed it to you, if that's right.
Yeah.
What would we need to do to upgrade the infrastructure? Did you get that?
We did.
No. Okay. So the question is around electric vehicles and the sustainability of electric vehicles with the national grid at the moment. In other words, if everyone had an electric vehicle and plugged them all in at the same time, you know, it's a bit like plugging in for a cup of tea during a football match. Everybody does it at the same time. Will that cause a problem to the grid? And is there a power drain with electric vehicles? Yeah. So does the national grid need to be uprated for the new cars which are coming along?
Quite possibly. We've actually got one of our fellow PhD students is looking at demand management of EV charging, because it's essentially an open question, and it, like a lot of things, it comes down to behavior. And if you understand that people will be charging predictably in bulk times, kind of like you just get peak travel times, and people say, I'm going to charge at this time, and everybody's doing it, that will be a huge issue for the national grid. However, what a lot of automotive companies are trying to do is work out ways of either incentivizing charging at particular times, or even potentially programming cars to try and manage and buffer the energy, almost like off-grid storage systems, because this is a very real issue, and it's something that the automotive companies are aware of, the grid is aware of, and there are an awful lot of researchers, particularly in electrical engineering, funnily enough, who are looking at the most effective ways to try and manage that problem. But yes, ultimately, it could be a kind of grid level requirement to improve things. I don't know if Rita, you know any more.
I don't know any more than you do.
So Chris also had a subsidiary question around the durability of batteries in cars. I think, was that, yeah, how many years they last, and what is the future for recycling old batteries?
That, again, that's a really interesting question. And there's, if you're interested in that, the Warwick Manufacturing Group, which is part of Coventry University, I think, or, well, no, part of Warwick University. Anyway, it's a big institute, and they're doing an awful lot of work on exactly this problem, because yes, particularly in a vehicle, batteries have a very limited lifespan, because they need to have a certain amount of their capacity usable to make them worthwhile lugging around in a car, because obviously they're very heavy. So the kind of weight to power ratio is a problem. And what a lot of companies are actually saying is most of the lifetime of a car's battery probably won't be driving the car around. You know, it will have a certain lifespan, and it's changing all the time. I don't yet know if it's in double figures realistically, but it will have a certain amount of lifespan depending on how it's driven very, very heavily, and also things like the weather. And then it's probably better used, taken out of that vehicle, replaced with a new one, and used as a static battery to power something else, where the load can be much better managed. But there is a big issue with battery recycling. It's possible, it's hard, it's expensive. And obviously there are a lot of rare earth metals and materials in batteries that are difficult to recycle, but also you don't just want to leave them hanging around in endless batteries that we don't know where we're going to put them. So one of the things that Warwick Manufacturing Group are trying to do is solve that problem. But it is a problem.
Are you involved at all in the new battery plants that are being set up here? I think there's one in Sunderland or near Teesside. Are you involved in any of that research?
I don't think we are. I know the primary battery research group within IAAPS that I'm aware of is actually looking at solid state batteries. So the principle behind that is saying, if we're saying that a battery is going to power, say, for example, a car, obviously the weight of the battery is one of the significant drawbacks to that, because it limits the range and things like this. So they're saying if we can make batteries solid state, we can start to almost build a car out of a battery, which reduces the weight problem. And that's a very, very big area of research at Bath at the moment. I don't think we're involved in any of the sort of production side of things. No.
There was a question over there. Can we take? Sorry. Yeah. Did you get that?
No.
Not at all.
The gentleman was saying that there doesn't seem to be a standard for battery production. So unlike Duracell, the AAAs, and whatever, there seem to be different models of different cars coming out with different batteries, and it would be good to have one standard so that they were interchangeable in principle.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, that's a problem, and it's a problem right down to the cell level, because obviously you've got the battery pack, and then within the pack there are battery cells, and different companies use different pack configurations, different cell configurations, and it is an issue. And like I think a lot of issues in automotive, it's down to that thing of how much the companies want to differentiate and make their thing so they can have proprietary technologies and potentially proprietary systems within the vehicle, and how much they want to open it up so that it can be as efficient as possible. And I think particularly with things like batteries, and I'm not a battery scientist, but from talking to my friends who are, it's one of those things where the technology is moving really quickly. Companies are they're throwing their lot in with a particular technology, then seeing how far that goes, and then trying to jump when they think the time is right. So I would say probably eventually they will be standardized, and from a purely practical perspective, they probably should be. But I don't know how easily that will happen. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, Rita. Sorry, I keep on.
I think that you're doing that because I'm not an expert in batteries at all. So
We're still on the battery theme, though. If there are any more questions on battery, now so we can move on. So there's a question here about the networks and domestic charging, and how many people can actually get on the grid from a cable which runs down your street, and how that can be beefed up. I think there's more charging points going in, but they're not enough. I think be the feedback from us, and it's also true to say that the government are pressing now for new homes to be built with charging points included in the specification.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I think we've got a concern just about the demand on the system in total, not only from cars, but also heat pumps and everything else, which is all moving towards digitization and advanced technology. So it's a big issue for government and infrastructure planning.
It absolutely is. And I mean, I'm sure Rita's kind of more suited to me to talk about the infrastructure side of things, but I know, again, within IAAPS, there's Vincent Zhang, who's one of the, I think he's a professor, if not, he's a senior lecturer. And he works an awful lot on understanding these processes. And it's going to be a huge transition in terms of the energy that's demanded and the patterns at which it's demanded. And it's one of the biggest challenges they're facing in terms of how to predict it, and then after you've predicted it, how to manage it effectively without everything collapsing. And it links to some degree to when we were talking about the EV batteries, is that one of the proposed ways of managing the having a lot of batteries that have got a lot more capacity, but they're no longer good to drive a vehicle, is to use them to balance the grid. So you have them as static batteries, and they can store and discharge energy at times of demand. And ideas like that, I know, are very, very much on people's minds as an option to do it. You've also got the option of using people's vehicles themselves to manage the grid, and because you can give energy in both directions. So there are interesting ideas, but it's very difficult.
Quite a few nodding heads here on that. Thank you.
Mm.
Were there any other questions about batteries? Or no? Fine. So can we take your question now? Yes, if you don't mind. Yeah, do. It's over here.
First of all, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So it's a mathematical question, but you won't necessarily have to provide a numeric answer because it might be a bit tricky. It's about energy delivery. Let's say we have two cars side by side. One is petrol, the other is straight electric. And here they are, 30 miles west of London, where we are. And let's say on average, the electricity that's being generated for recharging the electric car is coming from, say, off the northeast coast of Scotland. So what are the comparative costs of getting a carload of energy transported from off the northeast coast of Scotland through the grid, losing some energy through the resistance, and therefore the sending end has to work a bit harder to make up for that. And finally, enough energy is delivered to charge that car up for a range of, say, 250 miles. Meanwhile, the petrol car has refueled from the local filling station. Of course, that had to be replenished by a tanker, which burned fuel, etc., on its way, possibly from somewhere in Scotland even, or perhaps from Milford Haven. So if you compare the two, which is the more lossy method of energy delivery?
I don't know. That's an interesting question, but I know who would know.
Yeah.
Which is it's not the ideal answer, but there are two sort of clusters of researchers that are looking at this kind of problem within IAAPS. One of which are the life cycle analysis people. And their main goal is to say, if you've got something like, say, for example, the problem you're talking about, how can we sort of decompose it into its smallest units and calculate a figure which represents either the sustainability or the losses or whatever particular issue you're talking about. And that's one approach which is increasingly popular in terms of working out how sustainable EVs are really, in terms of production and in terms of use and in terms of recycling. The other people are, we've got some mathematicians, which is way out of my my scope, hence why I'm not able to answer your question, but they're looking at exactly the sorts of problems you're looking at, essentially optimization problems, and saying, how can we look at the most efficient ways of doing something, whether that be propelling a vehicle or whether that be delivering the fuel. And those problems are interesting problems and challenging problems to solve. And I think there are some interesting potential solutions. If you can understand the answer to your question, for example, you can then start understanding where the parameters within which EVs are sustainable to fuel, and what the kind of conditions are where you can say, okay, if we're getting the energy from here and we're delivering it there in these ways, it becomes manageable. Whereas if you do it like this, actually it becomes an inefficient process. And yeah, I think probably Rita and I are both not your people for the maths and the numbers, but your people for the maths and the numbers are people that we know. They're just not here, unfortunately.
It's a good question because it broadens out the whole subject, doesn't it? It's not just buying electric vehicles, it's supposedly more sustainable. Actually, there are a lot of processes involved in making that vehicle, some which may or may not be sustainable compared to the petrol alternative. You've got a follow-up question. Okay, quickly, yes, if you don't mind.
Could it be that the answer to this is that instead of the government giving grants to install your own power charging point, you only get the grant if you install the charging point and you also install enough solar panels to feed the thing yourself and not take it from the grid? Is that the solution? If
Possibly.
to localize the whole problem instead.
Possibly. And there's a very interesting paper that I read a couple of years ago on microgrids, which is a sort of scaled up version of what you're suggesting. And the idea was that in rural communities in the Highlands, they could essentially have completely renewable microgrids that would power them without interface with the national grid. And it operates in very, very small villages, I think 1 or 2 villages in the Highlands. But the principle of that could obviously be extended to have sort of buffered microgrids for EV charging, and you could theoretically have them be completely renewable. And I mean, I think it's a wonderful solution. It's complex, but it's really efficient and effective. And yeah, essentially, I do agree with you.
Thank you. Tim, do you want to come and do it in front of them?
2 questions. The first one, the good news is that you may have noticed we are absolutely awash with free fuel. The only problem is it's combined with an oxygen atom. Now, has there been any research on how to split these hydrogen and atoms apart, you know, like a cheap and dirty method of doing it rather than the electrical method of hydrolysis? So you get your hydrogen, which you can use as a fuel. And the second one is, rather than batteries, have you looked at using fuel cells which run on hydrogen to run your electric motors and so forth?
Yes. Again, I couldn't give you the ins and outs of it from a technical perspective, but as we've said in response to most of these questions, you know the people who can, and there are a few people working on hydrogen fuel cells. There's also some work on ammonia fuel cells, which is another interesting option. And yes, there are multiple ways to synthesize hydrogen as a fuel. And I mean, I'm by no means an expert on it, but there are ways which are greener than others. But it's certainly an ongoing area of research. And I know that Toyota have hydrogen vehicles, and that's something that in Japan is much more common and more popular than it is here, for example, because it's a question of infrastructure as much as anything else. And in Aberdeen, they've really gone in for hydrogen as well, and there's a lot of research around hydrogen. They've got hydrogen buses, and it's sort of an interesting open question about whether people are going to tip towards EV or fuel cell vehicle. And it seems like the UK is going EV, whereas countries like Japan potentially are going more fuel cell. But yeah.
Thank you. Joe, did you have a question? Anyone else? Anything about driver behaviour or safety or infrastructure planning or anything like that? Come and do it in front of the, so you can.
Right, okay. Question. Have you noticed any changes as yet between drivers of, say, electric vehicles, hybrids, and conventional internal combustion engine cars? Open-ended question, I'm sorry, but yeah.
In terms of their driving behaviour?
Absolutely, yeah.
The honest answer is I don't know. There's a lot of interesting research about the changes that basically the difference in driving a standard vehicle efficiently and driving a hybrid or electric vehicle efficiently. And there has been some work done within the department about how people make that adaptation and how you can better help people to adjust to the different, for example, acceleration and braking patterns, which make the best use out of a battery versus what might make the most efficient use out of an engine, and helping people transition to that. I think in terms of changes in driver behavior based on the propulsion system people are using, I honestly don't know, but it's a very, very interesting question. Do you know anything on that, Rita?
Maybe at least I'm just guessing this because, for example, when we have our phones, I'm always concerned about my battery. So I'm guessing maybe people have this perception of trying to save battery and trying to drive more sustainably in terms of saving the battery and prolonging its lifespan. But that's just an educated guess, I guess. But yeah.
Yeah.
We did have a discussion though in our plenary session, didn't we, around the car dealers who sell electric vehicles. They don't necessarily explain all the features and how to drive an electric vehicle sustainably, efficiently, and so on. They just give you the keys and say, here it is, you know, go and start. So there is a lot of driver education to do around that. And we were saying that Guy may want to pick that up, didn't we? Because range anxiety is coming up now. Yes. Got to fill up. What? So there's a discussion here about when in a petrol car the gauge goes into the red, the brain, the driver automatically thinks, well, I've got to go and fill up. So you go to the nearest petrol station to fill it up quickly before you run out and embarrass yourself on the road. And then the gentleman here was saying he's had an electric vehicle for 5 years and he's changed his mindset about the whole driving experience and you know, getting that refueling that range sorted out. So it's a mindset thing as well, but it's also something around, you know, not having the number of filling stations, number of, you know, power points around the place, isn't it? Which will have to be addressed if we all start using electric vehicles.
I would argue, is there a perception of, maybe I'm wrong on this, like free energy, that people say, oh, nothing coming out the exhaust pipe, oh great, it only cost me 70 pence to fill up, I can just carry on, you know. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
No, thank you.
Did you get that one?
No.
So are EV drivers reluctant to drive at night because of the extra consumption on the battery? I suppose in the winter as well.
I think that's an interesting question. I think I would be surprised if most electric vehicle drivers knew about the different the operation of a battery in different conditions. I think that it's probably something you'd learn as you were using it, but
yeah, well, it's been used.
Yeah,
Biggest
I
issue.
don't know.
Oh, you had your hand up, Chris. Yes. So sharp focus with the COP discussions and so on. Are electric vehicles really more green than petrol or diesel engines?
That's a question.
Big one.
It depends. What do you think, Rita?
Yeah, again, I think it depends. I mean, again, as Catherine mentioned, we have people working on sort of the life cycle analysis of, well, in this case, it's more related to batteries, I think, but it would be worth to extend this. And again, it would be a really big project because you have to think about where does the energy for these batteries comes from, where are the materials coming from as well. So in every stage of the vehicle, so assembly, operation, maintenance, everything. So you have to take all of these stages into consideration. So I think this is a really big question, and in each stage, there are a lot of different variables that could make a really big difference in the overall outcome. So yeah, I don't think I have an answer for that because again, it depends on the manufacturing process and so on.
From a human perspective as well, one of the biggest variables that you get with that is how the vehicle is actually used. Because obviously when you're dealing with a battery as well, the way you use that battery will affect its lifespan. And one of the interesting things that I've got a very limited knowledge of life cycle analysis, but within my limited knowledge of life cycle analysis, one of the interesting things is that as opposed to a sort of standard vehicle where a lot of the emissions are lifetime use emissions, and the embedded emissions in terms of from manufacturing the car and getting all the materials and whatnot are lower, in an EV it's kind of the inverse of that. So there's a huge emissions debt at the beginning, which is paid up just simply by putting the battery together effectively and then wrapping it in a vehicle. And in terms of the materials that are used in that, the carbon emissions that are generated from that, all of those sorts of things means that that car effectively has a debt to pay. And then throughout its life, the use emissions of that, if you don't factor in things like tire particulates and stuff like that, just tailpipe, obviously that's zero, but you've then got all the generation of the electricity to power the car, which is a big question mark because it depends on where you're getting the power from. But then you've also got the relative to how long you've used it, how much of that initial carbon debt have you burnt off to make it worth it? And I think from a psychology perspective, the interesting question is how much does somebody have to drive it, and how efficiently does somebody have to drive it to make it worthwhile? And then if you're racking up the miles like that, is that the way we want people to be moving around? And you get an interesting question. But it's way beyond the scope of my knowledge to answer it, but it is interesting.
So the more you do over 70,000 miles, the better the electric is. Yeah. There's a tipping point at 70,000 miles. Volvo, who have done some research on it.
Okay.
Within about 3 years.
Yes.
So people will be swapping their cars.
Yeah. They would know. I mean, I know what mine would be. It'd be a long time. but I mean, a lot of PCP arrangements, aren't there, which trade a car in after 3 years and you haven't used it really. Yeah.
It goes to the crusher.
Yes. Did you get that? The greenest car is the one you've already got because it saves another one being built.
Yeah, and there's a strong argument for that, and I think there'll be an interesting question about how you balance the need to transition people out of vehicles which have a higher emissions impact versus the issue of making everything new. It's
Derek, a question at the back. Derek, do you want to? Yes. Are we rushing too quickly into electric cars?
That depends on who you ask. From my
would say no.
Yeah, I think probably not, but it at least being around like propulsion system researchers and alternative fuel researchers, I think there is a real concern because on the one hand, we need to cut driving related emissions very quickly, very soon. And EVs are there and they can help do that. But there are lots of other options as well in terms of alternative fuels to put in traditional cars, which obviously has a lot of benefits, and things like hydrogen, fuel cells, other modes of transport, all sorts of things. And it's that question of, is it the wrong decision? Maybe not. Is it wrong to not make a decision based on how long research can take to find the answer which is better? Probably. Like there's no one answer to that. It's a very, very difficult question. I think history will tell us.
Yeah.
Will, you've got questions, and maybe you ought to wrap it up after that. Yes. Mhm. Makes you wonder if it's a big marketing wheeze, actually, all this, doesn't it? Mm. 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 So it could be a disposable product, which is what we're saying, because EVs, you know, the technology will change so quickly. From what you've suggested, you know, with all the other options that are available, suddenly it'll become, oh, you know, there'll be a dash to do a hydrogen vehicle or a fuel cell vehicle or whatever, and suddenly all the EVs that we bought, you know, like the diesels we bought before will be scrapped, and we'll be into a new technology. And it's almost like a comparison gentleman's made with the iPhone, you know, where they just bring out a new model to cause the others to be obsolete.
It's possible. I think there's it's possible, and I think the thing with EVs that is in our favor is that the electric grid is very established. Like in terms of infrastructure, it's difficult to put in charging points. It's much easier to do that than to put in hydrogen refueling stations. And I think it might be that in the long term, there's a better solution that comes out and supersedes it. But I think in reality, to do that at scale nationally would take decades at the quickest, if it was moving really, really fast and very, very heavily invested in by government, which isn't going to happen. So I think probably they won't be superseded quickly. In the long term, they might be, would be my kind of uneducated opinion, I guess.
Mr. Tesla can pay, Elon Musk can pay. I think on that one, we will finish there. But I'd like to thank the two ladies on the call very much indeed. There are a lot of questions that came up which were sort of not answered, and perhaps there's further research to do. And I think with the recording we've got, we can dissect those questions and start to build some projects around them, perhaps mini projects, or at least to find out, you know, some of the more the more important questions that we raised this evening could be answered, maybe in a year or so's time, when we've had more time to consider them. But thank you very much for your participation this evening. It's good to be on the line for at least an hour and a bit, and we're all grateful to you. So thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll have a break now. I suppose you'll go and have a cup of coffee and yeah, do something else.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye. Bye. There we go.